Welcome, traveler. You've found your way to this quiet corner of the night, where stories whisper and shadows stretch. I am the storyteller, and tonight, I'll guide you into a world of mystery and dreams. I know many of you come here to unwind, to let your mind drift as sleep slowly takes over. So before we begin, take a deep breath, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps keep the stories alive. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it? I love knowing how far my voice reaches in the silence of the night. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let the story begin. My name's Jack Carter, and I've spent more nights on the open road than I care to count. I've been a long-haul truck driver for almost 2 decades now, crisscrossing every major highway in the country more times than I can remember. After all these years, I've learned to embrace solitude. The hum of my rig's engine, the whisper of tires rolling over asphalt, and the soft glow of dashboard lights have become as familiar to me as breathing. Tonight, though, something felt different. I was driving through a lonely stretch of highway somewhere deep in Arizona. It was the kind of place you'd usually pass through without a second glance. Just endless, dusty plains and scattered rocks on either side, illuminated by the faint glow of headlights. I'd taken this route before, or at least I thought I had, but the road felt more isolated than usual tonight. There wasn't a single star visible in the sky, hidden behind thick clouds that smothered any trace of moonlight. Darkness pressed heavily on all sides, turning the world beyond my headlights into an endless void. My eyes flicked instinctively toward the clock on the dash, 1:47 a.m. I'd been driving for hours without encountering another soul, and the stillness of the night was beginning to feel unsettling rather than peaceful. I fiddled with the radio dial, searching for anything that might drown out the eerie silence. After cycling through static-filled stations, a faint melody broke through. It was some old country song, familiar yet distant, as though it had traveled across decades just to reach my ears. I leaned back in my seat, settling into the comforting rhythm of the music. But suddenly, the song twisted and warped, the singer's voice turning deep and distorted, sending an unpleasant chill down my spine. I quickly reached out and shut it off, plunging the cab into silence once again. Shaking my head, I tried to brush off the creeping discomfort. After all, every driver has heard their share of ghost stories. Trucks appearing out of nowhere, shadowy hitchhikers vanishing into thin air, mysterious figures walking alongside deserted roads. I'd laughed at those tales over cups of black coffee at roadside diners, dismissing them as nonsense invented by bored drivers with overactive imaginations. But tonight, alone in the heart of nowhere, those same stories didn't seem so silly. A flicker of movement caught my eye, pulling me back to reality. Up ahead, a roadside sign emerged from the darkness, illuminated briefly by my headlights. Its faded, cracked paint was peeling away, and the letters had worn thin with age. I squinted, trying to make out the words, but the sign passed too quickly to decipher. A faint unease stirred in my chest. Had I missed my turn? It wouldn't have been the first time. On roads like these, getting lost was easier than you'd think. My truck suddenly jolted, and the headlights dimmed sharply for a split second before returning to normal brightness. My heart leapt to my throat, but I forced myself to calm down. Just a loose wire or something, I muttered aloud, trying to steady my breathing. Yet even as I spoke, I felt a growing tension inside, a primal sense of dread I'd never experienced in all my years behind the wheel. Outside, the only sound aside from my truck's steady engine was the distant chirping of crickets, fading in and out like a weak radio signal. Everything around me was utterly still, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out here. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes fixed on the empty highway stretching endlessly into the night. Little did I know, that unsettling sense of loneliness was just the beginning of something far more sinister. I rubbed my eyes and rolled down the window, hoping the rush of cool air would shake off the unease still lingering in my bones. It didn't help much. Everything outside felt like a vacuum, swallowing sound, swallowing light. I was just about to consider pulling over for a moment to clear my head when a sudden brightness caught my eye. Glancing into my side mirror, relief flooded through me at first. A massive truck had appeared in the distance, its headlights slicing through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows along the edges of the highway. I exhaled deeply, letting the tension slip from my shoulders. Seeing another traveler out here, especially after such a prolonged period of isolation, felt reassuring. But that feeling quickly turned into something else. Curiosity mixed with a subtle dread. The truck was gaining rapidly, far too fast for comfort, closing the gap with unnerving determination. Within moments, it was directly behind me, its massive headlights shining brightly enough to blind me in the mirrors. I squinted, shielding my eyes from the glare. "Easy there, buddy," I muttered under my breath, irritation creeping into my voice. I've seen my share of reckless drivers, but something about the way this rig moved felt off. It wasn't just aggressive, it felt deliberate, purposeful. I nudged the accelerator slightly, inching my rig forward to gain some distance, but the truck behind matched my pace exactly. I eased off the gas to test it again, but it slowed as well, mimicking my every move like a shadow tethered to my own truck. My heart started to beat faster, a cold anxiety crawling up my spine. "What the hell do you want?" I whispered, my eyes darting nervously between the road ahead and the headlights blazing behind me. The truck was enormous, probably a big rig, even larger than mine, with an intimidating silhouette I couldn't quite identify in the darkness. But worst of all, despite its closeness, I couldn't make out any details beyond its harsh headlights. It seemed cloaked entirely in shadow, an absence of detail that made it feel somehow unnatural. Then something else caught my attention, something impossible. As I stared through the rearview mirror, straining to see into the truck's cab, my blood froze in my veins. There was no driver, no silhouette, no figure, nothing. Just a vacant, dark emptiness where a driver should have been. I shook my head vigorously, heart hammering inside my chest. "Come on, Jack. Get it together," I mumbled, gripping the wheel tighter. Was this a hallucination? Had exhaustion finally taken hold of my mind? Maybe it was just some prank, a bored driver pulling a sick joke out here in the emptiness of the desert night. Whatever it was, I didn't want any part of it. Ahead, I saw a turnoff coming up quickly, an old secondary road that might help me lose whoever or whatever was tailing me. Without hesitation, I swung onto it sharply, my tires skidding slightly against loose gravel. To my dismay, the phantom truck mirrored my every move flawlessly, its movements mechanical yet impossibly fluid, as though it anticipated my intentions before I even made them. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, my breathing growing shallow as panic began to take hold. "Leave me alone," I shouted out loud, the words swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence around me. In response, the truck surged forward abruptly, closing the narrow gap between us so quickly I barely had time to react. Its massive grille now loomed dangerously close in my mirrors, headlights blazing like twin suns, forcing me to swerve precariously onto the shoulder. The road beneath my tires cracked and crumbled along its edges, loose rocks bouncing violently against the undercarriage. I wrestled desperately with the steering wheel, my palms slick with sweat. The monstrous truck pressed closer still, and now I heard its horn. Deep, guttural, reverberating through my bones. The sound wasn't just loud, it was wrong, unnatural, like an animal's roar twisted through metal. Fear choked me, tightening my throat, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Each inhale felt like pulling air through heavy mud, thick and suffocating. Something unnatural had taken hold of this place, this road, wrapping itself around me, trapping me. I couldn't rationalize what was happening, couldn't explain it away as fatigue or tricks of the mind anymore. Whatever pursued me was real, terrifyingly real. "Please," I begged quietly, desperately, though I didn't know who or what I was pleading with. "Please just stop." As if responding cruelly to my plea, the truck surged again, this time slamming into my trailer's bumper. The collision rattled my entire cab, sending a violent shudder through my bones. I gasped, fighting for control as the steering wheel jerked violently in my hands. The phantom truck's engine roared louder, angrier, filling the night air with a deafening, metallic growl. I pressed harder on the accelerator, urging my rig faster down this unfamiliar road, though instinctively I knew escape was impossible. The phantom matched my speed effortlessly, shadowing me with a predatory precision that drained any remaining hope from my heart. I glanced again into the mirror, unable to resist, and immediately regretted it. The empty cab seemed darker now, deeper somehow, as though it absorbed every bit of surrounding light. Even its headlights, though blindingly bright, felt devoid of warmth or humanity. A cold, lifeless stare aimed directly at me. Ahead, the road narrowed further, hemmed in by shadowy desert brush and jagged rocks, offering no escape. My heart sank. Panic surged through me in a sickening wave. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare far too real to dismiss. I could do nothing but drive forward, praying desperately that this phantom truck, whatever it was, might tire of its relentless pursuit before it pushed me beyond the brink. But deep inside, I knew this nightmare had only just begun. Adrenaline surged through my veins as panic turned into desperation. My heart hammered wildly against my ribcage, every beat echoing the same terrible truth. I had to end this now. There was no way I could outrun something that seemed beyond reason, something that defied all logic. But maybe, just maybe, I could outsmart it. In a sudden, reckless decision, I slammed my foot down hard on the brake pedal. Tires screeched violently against the pavement, smoke rising in a thick plume as my truck lurched forward and then came to a jolting halt. My seatbelt dug painfully into my chest as I braced myself, praying that whatever force was behind me would simply rush past, unable to react in time. For a heartbeat, everything went perfectly silent. I stared into my mirrors, chest heaving with anxious breaths. My entire body trembled, anticipation mingling with fear. But the phantom didn't pass. Instead, with terrifying precision, the monstrous rig behind me had stopped too, perfectly mirroring my every move. There was no screeching of brakes, no roar of an engine coming to a halt. Just silence. Absolute, impossible silence. Even its lights had vanished completely, leaving behind a hulking silhouette shrouded entirely in darkness, more ominous than ever. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went numb and turned a ghostly white. Cold sweat dripped down my forehead as I sat frozen, terrified to make the slightest move, my ears straining desperately for some sound. Anything to break this suffocating silence. But nothing came. No hum of engines, no distant crickets, no whisper of wind. It was as though the world itself had stopped breathing. My radio suddenly crackled to life, breaking the unnatural quiet. At first, it was just static, rough and grating. I leaned toward the dashboard, listening intently, desperate for some sign of humanity, some clue that reality hadn't completely unraveled around me. But what came next drained every ounce of warmth from my body. Amid the static, barely audible, yet horribly distinct, a voice whispered through the speakers, distorted and otherworldly, yet unmistakably speaking my name. Jack! My blood turned ice cold, my breath hitching painfully in my throat. It wasn't a random interference, not a trick of my imagination. It knew me, called for me specifically, reaching out through the static as though it had always known I'd come here. No, I whispered, voice quivering. No, this isn't real. But before I could even process my terror, the headlights of the phantom truck suddenly flickered to life, slowly at first, dim and flickering like candles burning out, then violently exploding into brightness again, flooding my cab with harsh, unnatural white light. The entire rig shuddered as if waking from a terrible slumber, roaring back to life with a deep growl that resonated inside my bones. Without another thought, pure instinct took over. My foot slammed down on the accelerator, sending my truck hurtling forward once again. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care if I was lost or if the road ahead ended abruptly. All I knew was that staying still meant death, Or worse, something far beyond my understanding. Behind me, the phantom surged forward again, immediately closing the gap. But this time, it moved differently, as though it had cast aside any pretense of acting like a normal vehicle. It came at me with impossible speed, effortlessly matching my desperate acceleration. Its headlights burned brighter, now flickering wildly, as if fueled by something malevolent, something alive. The road ahead seemed to warp, twisting unnaturally, bending into shapes that defied logic. Lines blurred, asphalt shifted, and for a moment, it felt as though I was driving into nothingness itself. The sky above vanished, swallowed by darkness. Even the faint silhouette of desert mountains faded from view. Reality was coming undone all around me. Roadside signs flashed past, words twisting and melting into incomprehensible symbols. Trees appeared where none had been before, then vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by shadows stretching impossibly across the landscape. My mind struggled to grasp what I was seeing. Was I losing my sanity, or had I driven straight into a nightmare from which there was no waking? The phantom truck was relentless, its horn blaring again, a sound now so distorted and monstrous it resonated like a demon's roar echoing through the night. It charged closer, its lights blazing brighter, hotter, burning into my eyes even when I turned away. The air inside my cab grew thick and stifling, pressing down on my chest like an unseen hand, squeezing the air from my lungs. "Leave me alone," I screamed desperately, voice cracking, breaking under the strain. But there was no mercy here, no escape from this dark highway that felt increasingly detached from reality itself. The phantom surged again, slamming once more into my trailer, this time harder, more violently, forcing my truck dangerously close to the edge of the road. Gravel and dirt sprayed into the air as I fought desperately for control, the steering wheel slippery now beneath my sweaty palms. My vision blurred with tears born from panic and exhaustion, but I refused to give in. If this night was determined to claim me, it would have to fight for it. Summoning every bit of courage left in my battered body, I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, ignoring the shaking of my vehicle, ignoring the darkness swallowing everything around me, ignoring even the terrible, whispered laughter that had begun crackling through the static-filled radio. Because somewhere deep inside, buried beneath panic and fear, I still clung stubbornly to one belief. This nightmare, no matter how real, couldn't last forever. All I had to do was survive until morning. But as reality continued to collapse around me, I wondered if morning would ever come, or if I was destined to drive forever through this impossible night. In the distance, a dim glow pierced through the darkness, a pale beacon of hope amidst the madness around me. A gas station, nearly hidden behind a curtain of dust and shadow, emerged like a miracle just off the roadside. My heart surged with desperate relief. Without a second thought, I yanked the wheel sharply, tires screaming as I skidded off the twisted highway toward the flickering lights. My rig groaned in protest as I barreled into the gravel parking lot, kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed everything behind me. The brakes squealed violently as I jerked the truck to a sudden halt near the dimly lit pumps. My pulse thundered in my ears. Sweat poured down my face as I threw open the cab door, stumbling out onto shaking legs. The night air felt cold and sharp in my lungs, snapping me out of the panic-induced daze. I turned immediately, bracing for the monstrous glare of headlights and the roar of an engine that had been chasing me relentlessly through the darkness. But there was nothing, only silence. The phantom truck had vanished, leaving the road empty as though it had never been there at all. The oppressive darkness that had engulfed me moments ago had retreated, replaced by the quiet hum of the gas station's flickering neon sign, a gentle buzzing noise that felt strangely comforting. I leaned against my truck, gasping, each ragged breath burning painfully in my chest. "Gone," I whispered to myself, barely believing my own eyes. "It's gone. You all right there, son?" I spun around, startled. Standing a few feet away, illuminated by the pale glow from the station, was an elderly attendant in greasy overalls. He watched me cautiously from beneath a faded baseball cap, his eyes wary yet strangely understanding. You, you saw it, didn't you? He asked quietly, glancing down the road behind me. My throat tightened. What? My voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. The truck, he said slowly. The phantom truck. My blood ran cold. Until now, I desperately clung to the hope that what I'd experienced had been nothing but a hallucination, a trick my exhausted mind had played. But this man spoke with grim certainty. He knew exactly what had chased me through the darkness. How do you know? I asked weakly. He hesitated briefly before sighing, as though he'd told this story too many times. You ain't the first driver to come stumbling in here looking like he's just seen hell itself. That thing's been haunting this highway since before I started working here. Longer than you or me have been around, probably. What is it? I asked, still trembling, desperate for any explanation that might ground this madness in reality. The old man glanced down at his boots, then raised his eyes to meet mine again. Folks around here call it the phantom truck. A ghost rig. Story goes, it used to belong to a trucker named Frank Holloway, mean bastard by all accounts. Liked to run these roads fast and careless. One night, decades back, Holloway was speeding down this very stretch of road, reckless and drunk, and he pushed another vehicle right off into a ditch. It rolled over, caught fire instantly, and killed an entire family. Mother, father, their 2 kids. Folks say Holloway didn't even slow down to check. Kept driving like nothing happened, until karma caught up to him a few miles down the road. Lost control of his rig, crashed into the rocks, and died screaming inside his own burning truck. My stomach twisted painfully at the image, vividly picturing the flames consuming Holloway as his life ended in agony. Ever since that night, he continued softly, eyes distant, haunted. Drivers on this road say they sometimes see him. Holloway's truck comes out of nowhere, chasing them down, just like he chased that family, repeating what he did again and again, punishing anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. I felt cold, goosebumps crawling over my skin. But why me? Why tonight? He shrugged, shaking his head sadly. Who knows? Sometimes I think he picks drivers at random. Other times, maybe it's fate. Whatever it is, you're lucky to still be standing here. My heart refused to slow down, even in this temporary calm. Is it gone now? He gave a grim smile, but his eyes held little reassurance. For now, but it always comes back. It never stays gone for long. He turned away then, leaving me standing alone beneath the humming neon sign, heart hammering painfully inside my chest. My mind raced, overwhelmed by everything he had told me. I wanted desperately to deny it, to call it just another road legend, another ridiculous ghost story whispered among tired drivers in late-night diners. But after what I'd experienced, I could no longer dismiss it as mere superstition. Needing a moment of clarity, I turned back to my truck, glancing instinctively toward my trailer. My blood ran ice cold as I noticed deep dents and dark scorch marks across the metal, damage far more severe than any simple collision should have caused. Then my gaze fell upon something else, something even more horrifying. Soot-covered handprints, dozens of them, smeared across the trailer's surface, as though countless tortured souls had desperately clawed at it in agony. I backed away, feeling my stomach churn violently, until my back hit the cab door. When I turned around again, my gaze fell on the windshield, where 3 words had appeared, scratched roughly into the grime, clearly meant for me alone. See you soon. A scream lodged in my throat, choking me, as I stared helplessly at the ominous message. My legs gave way beneath me, sending me sliding down the side of my rig, collapsing onto the dusty ground. All the courage I'd mustered evaporated instantly, leaving behind only helpless, suffocating dread. The phantom truck hadn't disappeared. It had merely retreated into the darkness, waiting patiently to return. Waiting for me. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, eyes locked on those horrifying words scratched into the dirt on my windshield. My pulse throbbed painfully in my temples, echoing the haunting message over and over again inside my head. But standing still wasn't an option. Not here, not now. Gathering whatever scraps of courage I still had left, I wiped the sweat from my brow, took one shaky breath, and climbed back into the cab. The gas station attendant watched me silently from the shadows of the dimly lit building, his expression unreadable yet heavy with quiet understanding. I gave him a small nod, mouthing a silent thank you, and turned the ignition. My truck roared back to life, engine rumbling steadily beneath me, reassuringly normal despite the lingering sense that everything around me had changed forever. Pulling back onto the highway felt like plunging straight into dark waters again, my headlights slicing weakly through the oppressive night. My eyes darted anxiously from side to side, every shadow now a threat, every flicker of darkness whispering the promise of another attack. Despite the profound exhaustion weighing down my bones, there was no way I was stopping. Not now, not tonight, perhaps never again on this cursed stretch of road. Minutes stretched into hours, time losing its meaning as I pressed onward, desperately fleeing a terror I couldn't begin to understand. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point, every muscle in my body wound tight. Yet still, I forced myself to push forward, compelled by a primal need to escape something I couldn't even fully comprehend. The night remained silent, ominous, until suddenly, without warning, my radio burst into a familiar wave of static. My heart clenched painfully, and dread surged again through my veins as I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "Jack," whispered the voice, clearer now, sharp and intimate, reaching directly into my ears. My blood turned to ice, and chills rippled across my skin. "Jack!" "No," I groaned, voice barely audible, panic tightening around my throat. "Please, not again. You can't run," it whispered, voice crackling, twisted, taunting. "I'll always find you." I slammed my fist against the radio, shutting it off in desperation, but the silence afterward was worse. It hung heavy and oppressive around me, broken only by my shallow, frightened breaths. Just as panic began to recede, the headlights flickered once more, plunging the highway ahead briefly into complete darkness. I gasped, eyes widening, bracing myself for the inevitable collision, the return of the massive truck, yet nothing appeared. The lights steadied, illuminating the empty road stretching ahead as though mocking my terror. But now I could feel a presence in the emptiness around me. The moonless night seemed darker somehow, colder, emptier. My body trembled, every instinct urging me to flee faster, farther. But no matter how many miles I placed between myself and that gas station, I knew deep in my bones that this wasn't over. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, desperate to escape the phantom that haunted my every thought. But even as the familiar hum of the engine filled my ears, I understood the grim reality. I'd never truly be alone on this road again. The phantom truck, Frank Holloway's restless spirit trapped behind the wheel, would always be waiting, lingering just beyond the edge of sight, hiding in every dark curve, every empty stretch of highway, patient and merciless. Someday, it would return for me, and next time, I might not escape. All I could do now was drive forward into the endless night, forever glancing over my shoulder, forever waiting for the haunting roar of the phantom truck to rise again out of the darkness behind me. When my wife Sarah passed away 2 years ago, I thought I'd never feel normal again. But life doesn't wait for anyone, and my 12-year-old son Ethan needed me more than ever. I had to be strong for him, even when my own heart was breaking. That's what led us here, to an old suburban house on the quiet edge of town. It wasn't anything special, just a simple 2-story house, with fading white paint and shutters hanging loosely on their hinges. But the moment I saw it, I felt it had potential. More importantly, it had the peace we both desperately needed. I wanted Ethan to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere we could start fresh without constant reminders of loss. Ethan seemed excited too. For a 12-year-old who'd been forced to mature faster than any child should, he adapted quickly. Maybe it was the promise of new friends or exploring a new place. Either way, seeing him smile again made everything worth it. One thing we didn't expect was the state of the backyard. It was massive, much larger than I'd realized, hidden beneath layers of weeds and bushes that had overtaken it completely. Clearly, the previous owners hadn't stepped foot there in years. It was on a hot afternoon in late July when Ethan and I finally decided to tackle the yard. Armed with gloves, shovels, and determination, we spent hours pulling up weeds, cutting through thick vines, and turning over hardened earth. The air was heavy, the sun relentless, and sweat ran freely down our faces. "Hey, Dad," Ethan called, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "What do you think we'll find back here?" "Hopefully nothing more dangerous than spiders." I laughed, trying to hide my own exhaustion. Ethan smiled and returned to digging, driving the shovel deep into the earth. Moments later, the metallic clang of his shovel striking something solid echoed through the quiet yard. We froze, exchanging puzzled glances. "What was that?" Ethan asked cautiously. "Probably just an old pipe or rock," I assured him, though a sudden unease churned in my stomach. We both knelt down and brushed away the soil, revealing the rusted edge of what appeared to be a metal box, about the size of a small suitcase. Its corners were worn smooth by decades underground, and thick rust spread across its surface like a disease. Carefully, Ethan and I pried the box from its resting place, pulling it free from the earth's grip. As we lifted it, I noticed strange markings etched deeply into the lid. They weren't random scratches. They looked intentional, like handwriting from another era. Elegant, yet eerie. A sudden chill crept down my spine despite the heat of the summer afternoon. I hesitated, my fingers hovering just above the rusted clasp. Something told me this was better left alone. I glanced at Ethan, who stared wide-eyed at our discovery, his curiosity clearly overriding any fear. "Let's open it, Dad," he whispered, his voice tinged with excitement and apprehension. Against my instincts, I forced the rusted latch loose, and with a hollow creak, the lid slowly opened. My heart thudded loudly in my chest as Ethan leaned closer, peering into the shadows within. Inside was an odd collection of items. A battered doll, its pale porcelain face cracked and stained, empty eye sockets staring up at us like tiny, dark tunnels. Beside it lay a bundle of faded photographs, their edges curled and yellowed with age. The images depicted a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, standing solemnly in front of our house. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her expression disturbingly vacant. Neither Ethan nor I recognized her face. Next was a small, silver locket, beautifully ornate but tarnished with age. As I turned it over, the name Rebecca shone faintly in the fading afternoon sun, delicately engraved. At the bottom lay a diary, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and fragile. Flipping through the brittle pages carefully, I found handwriting faded almost beyond recognition, except on the final page, where the ink remained dark, frantic, and desperate. The message there turned my blood cold. "Do not disturb the box. If you find it, bury it again. She is watching." My hands trembled, and Ethan's eyes met mine, filled with an innocence I suddenly feared we might soon lose. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible, "who is she?" I stared into my son's frightened face, the sun quickly disappearing behind a passing cloud, plunging us both into sudden, cold shadow. "I don't know," I admitted softly, wishing desperately I had never opened that box. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. My mind wouldn't let go of the strange warnings scribbled in that diary. Rationally, I knew it had to be some kind of twisted joke or prank left behind by bored teenagers decades ago, but my gut told me otherwise. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my anxiety, pulling me into uneasy sleep. The clock on my bedside table read exactly 2:17 a.m. when Ethan's frightened voice jarred me awake. "Dad, Dad, wake up." Ethan shook my shoulder urgently. I bolted upright, blinking rapidly in the dimness. "What is it? What's wrong?" I whispered, already alarmed by the fear in his voice. "There's someone outside my window. I heard tapping," he said, visibly trembling. Heart racing, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and quickly grabbed my flashlight. Ethan followed me closely down the hallway toward his bedroom, clutching my arm tightly. His room faced the backyard, and the window looked out directly onto the garden. now bathed in silvery moonlight, shadows stretching deep across the lawn. I approached cautiously, the wood floor creaking beneath our feet. Taking a deep breath, I parted the curtains and shined the flashlight outside. Nothing moved. The yard was completely still. Only shadows shifted subtly as clouds drifted over the moon. Everything was exactly as we'd left it earlier. Yet, the dark silhouette of the hole we'd dug earlier stared back at us like a black, empty eye. "There's nothing there, Ethan," I reassured him, trying to sound confident. Maybe it was a branch tapping on the window. He shook his head stubbornly. "No, Dad." Someone was whispering, too. I heard a girl's voice. She called my name. A cold chill slithered down my spine, but I quickly brushed it off. "It was just a nightmare," I said gently, squeezing his shoulder reassuringly. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he just stared silently at the darkness beyond his window, visibly troubled. The next morning brought no relief. The warm sunshine streaming through the kitchen window did little to ease my unease as I prepared breakfast. Ethan remained unusually quiet, pushing food around on his plate without appetite. While Ethan sat silently at the table, I found myself drawn back to the old photographs we'd discovered in the box. Carefully, I removed them from their bundle and placed them onto the counter. Something immediately felt wrong. The images appeared subtly different from how I remembered. The little girl's face, Rebecca, presumably, had become disturbingly distorted. Her once clear eyes were now empty black pits, darker than ink, filled with something sinister. My breath caught in my throat. How could the photos have changed overnight? I blinked, rubbing my eyes, convinced it was an illusion born from exhaustion. But no matter how closely I examined them, the horrifying details persisted. "Dad," Ethan's voice broke my concentration, and I quickly shoved the photos back into the box, trying to hide my shaking hands. "Yes, buddy. Can Rebecca join us for breakfast?" he asked matter-of-factly, glancing toward the empty chair beside him. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "What did you say?" "Rebecca," Ethan repeated innocently. "My new friend. She wants to sit with us." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Who's Rebecca?" I asked slowly, fearing the answer. He looked puzzled, as though it should be obvious. "The girl who lives here. She told me she used to live under the house." As soon as Ethan was safely occupied with a book upstairs, I hurriedly grabbed the diary from the box and retreated to my bedroom, shutting the door behind me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the fragile pages, searching for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret Holloway, whose neat, careful handwriting filled page after page. At first, the entries were ordinary, mentions of gardening, family dinners, and her daughter Rebecca's childhood adventures. Gradually, though, the tone darkened. Margaret described how Rebecca began talking to someone invisible. At first, she dismissed it as normal childhood imagination, but soon it became more concerning. Rebecca spoke of whispers from beneath the floorboards and insisted there was a friend who lived under the house. Margaret's worry intensified with each entry, her sentences becoming short and clipped, as though she feared to put certain things clearly into words. The later pages were filled with alarming descriptions. Rebecca waking in the night, screaming about a dark-haired woman who whispered terrible things to her. Margaret wrote of shadows moving in the corners, strange tapping sounds at the windows, and feeling as if she were constantly watched. One of Margaret's final entries chilled me deeply. "Rebecca disappeared last night. I saw it happen. God help me, I saw her taken. That thing came from beneath the house and dragged her down into the dark. My husband boarded up the basement, but I know it's not enough." The handwriting grew erratic after that, words smudged with tears or trembling hands. Finally, the entries ended abruptly with a single, hurried message. "She took Rebecca. We couldn't save her, but we locked her away. God forgive us." I closed the diary, breathless and shaken, the book slipping from my trembling hands onto the bed beside me. Whatever nightmare Margaret had endured decades ago had now resurfaced. Suddenly, I heard Ethan's laughter, bright and innocent, echoing from downstairs. My heart pounded heavily as I rushed down to find him sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, chatting casually to empty space beside him. "Ethan, who are you talking to?" I asked cautiously. He turned to me with a calm smile, as though everything was perfectly normal. "Rebecca. She says she's glad we found her." As he spoke, my gaze shifted to the dark corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to ripple and move, as if something unseen was indeed watching us. And suddenly, I understood the truth of Margaret's warning. There was something here, something old and angry. It was awake now, and it had already begun to claim my son. Days passed, and life inside the house steadily spiraled downward. What began as isolated incidents quickly intensified into an undeniable nightmare. At first, I tried desperately to rationalize everything, but soon, rational explanations became impossible. One evening, as I was cleaning up dinner, the door to the basement slammed violently shut, causing dishes to rattle in the cabinets. I spun around, my heart racing. There was no wind, no reason for it to happen. When I walked over cautiously to open it, I found the door cold to the touch, as if it had been submerged in ice. From that night onward, the house seemed alive. Lights flickered randomly, turning themselves off and on as if someone invisible played with the switches. Drawers opened on their own, and the quiet hours of the night filled with soft, unmistakable footsteps pacing through the hallways. Each night, I lay awake in bed, listening intently as those steps creaked toward Ethan's room, pausing just outside his door. I'd rush down the hallway, flashlight in hand, only to find emptiness and shadows waiting for me. Yet somehow, Ethan seemed strangely calm about everything, his demeanor growing distant and withdrawn. Then, Ethan began drawing. At first, it seemed like a healthy distraction, a harmless outlet for his imagination. But when I actually looked at what he'd been creating, I felt sick with dread. Ethan's sketchbook was filled page after page with the same haunting image. A shadowy girl, her face dark and featureless, except for empty, black holes where her eyes should have been. Always, she stood in our backyard, near the exact spot where we'd unearthed that cursed box. One picture showed her reaching out toward the house, fingers elongated and twisted like claws. "Ethan, who is this girl?" I finally mustered the courage to ask him one afternoon. "That's Rebecca," Ethan replied casually, his voice hollow and disturbingly indifferent. "She says she's lonely and wants me to stay with her." Fear twisted painfully in my gut. I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. I had to find answers, real ones, and quickly. The diary had given me the name Margaret Holloway. With desperate determination, I searched until I found her. She was still alive, nearly 90 years old, living quietly in a nursing home across town. With the box hidden safely in the trunk of my car, I drove immediately to see her, hoping beyond hope that she could explain what was happening. The nursing home was peaceful, its corridors lined with pastel wallpaper and cheerful artwork. It seemed worlds away from the terror gripping my home. Margaret sat alone in a small room, eyes distant but alert, her frail hands resting gently on her lap. Her silver hair was neatly combed, framing a face etched deeply with age and sorrow. "Mrs. Holloway?" I asked cautiously, stepping into the room. Her gaze flickered to meet mine, a quiet sadness reflected in her tired eyes. "Yes, dear? Do I know you? My name is Daniel Carter." I began nervously, taking a seat opposite her. "I recently moved into your old house. I found something buried in the backyard, a metal box." Instantly, Margaret's peaceful demeanor shattered. Her eyes widened in shock, face draining of color until it matched the stark whiteness of the room. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "You found it." I nodded gravely. "Yes, and now something is happening to my son. He sees her, Rebecca. I read your diary. What really happened back then?" Margaret reached for my hand, gripping it tightly despite her frailty. "Rebecca didn't just disappear," she said slowly, eyes glistening with tears. "She was taken. Something lived beneath that house. It had been there long before we ever moved in. Rebecca called it her friend, but it was no friend. It wanted her soul." My pulse quickened, and chills raced down my spine. "What did you do?" "We tried to save her," Margaret continued painfully. We tried everything. Priests, prayers, rituals, but nothing worked. That thing eventually took her. My husband and I knew we couldn't let it happen to anyone else. So, we performed an old ritual, something ancient, to trap the entity. We sealed it away beneath the earth, buried the box as a warning, praying no one would ever find it again. Her breathing became ragged, her thin chest heaving as she struggled to continue. But you've disturbed it. If you dug up the box, you've set her free. I felt sick with dread. What is she? Margaret's eyes darkened with fear. Rebecca isn't the one haunting you. It's the thing that took her, the thing that wears her face, mimics her voice. It hungers for innocence, for children. It's using her memory to lure your son. My heart pounded painfully. How do I stop it? She pulled me closer with surprising strength, urgency burning in her eyes. You must bury the box. Deeply, far away from the house. Seal it again. Don't wait. Do it tonight, before it's too late. But what if? Margaret's voice turned cold and grave, cutting me off mid-sentence. Listen carefully, Daniel. It took my daughter. It will take your son next. She isn't Rebecca anymore. She's something ancient, angry, and insatiable. Once it has your child, you'll never get him back. Her grip tightened, nails digging desperately into my arm. Bury the box, Daniel. Please, before she claims another child. As I left the nursing home, my thoughts spun wildly. Margaret's warning echoed in my head, clear and terrifying. The box weighed heavily on my mind, as did the increasingly dangerous threat surrounding Ethan. Time was running out, and I had to act before it was too late. Driving home beneath darkening skies, I felt the haunting presence of something unseen. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see hollow black eyes staring back. Instead, only darkness loomed behind me, silent and waiting. Somewhere, deep beneath my house, something ancient stirred awake. It knew I'd learned the truth, and now it was coming for Ethan. Sleep had become a luxury I could barely afford. Each time I closed my eyes, I was plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures crawling from the depths beneath the house, reaching for Ethan with hungry, claw-like fingers. Tonight was no exception, but this time, when I jerked awake, the sense of dread didn't fade. It grew stronger. My heart hammered painfully as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The house was deathly silent, except for the soft hum of distant whispers floating through the air. My skin prickled, the hairs standing on the back of my neck. Ethan, I called weakly, praying for an immediate response. Silence. I jumped from bed, adrenaline racing through me as I hurried to his room, my pulse thundering louder with every footstep. The door was already ajar, a cold breeze slipping through it like an invitation. Ethan, I called louder, my voice shaking with fear. His bed was empty, blankets thrown aside carelessly. The open window stared back at me like a hollow eye, the curtains gently swaying in the cool night air. My heart sank into my stomach. From outside, I heard it, a soft, melodic voice gently calling through the darkness. Come play with me, Ethan. I recognized it instantly, the deceptively innocent voice of a child, hiding something ancient and sinister. Without thinking, I sprinted through the house and burst into the backyard, stumbling blindly into the night. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver glow over the yard, turning shadows into living shapes. My eyes darted frantically until I spotted Ethan. He was standing perfectly still in the hole where we'd first discovered the box. He stared downward, mesmerized by something beneath his feet. Ethan, I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Instead, his small body began to tremble as something stirred beneath him, shifting the earth around his feet. In horror, I watched as dark fingers emerged, clawing through the dirt like roots searching for air. And then she appeared. Slowly, rising from the soil as though birthed by it, stood the spectral form of a girl. Her translucent skin clung loosely to bones beneath, features twisted and rotten. Long, tangled hair covered most of her decayed face, yet nothing could hide those gaping black holes that were her eyes. Rebecca, or the horrific thing that wore her face, was finally free. He belongs to me now, she whispered, her voice echoing with unnatural resonance. No, I roared, launching myself forward and grabbing Ethan's arm, yanking him out of the hole with strength born of desperation. The moment Ethan's feet left the earth, the figure let out an inhuman shriek. The ground beneath us shook violently, as though angered by our defiance. Ethan stumbled backward, finally snapping awake, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Dad? What's happening?" "Inside now," I shouted, half dragging, half carrying him toward the house. But behind us, Rebecca's twisted figure lunged forward with astonishing speed. Her decayed hands reached out hungrily, nearly touching Ethan as I slammed the back door shut. She collided with it violently, rattling the glass with an ear-splitting cry of rage. Inside, we both fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Ethan clung to me tightly, shaking uncontrollably. Outside, Rebecca paced the yard, flickering in and out of existence like a broken projection. "She won't stop." Ethan sobbed softly into my shoulder. "She said she'll never leave me alone." Margaret's words echoed painfully through my head. "You must bury the box. Deeply. Seal it again." It was the only hope we had. "Ethan, listen carefully," I said urgently, gripping his shoulders to steady us both. "We need to bury the box again. It's the only way." Without waiting for his reply, I grabbed the box from where I'd hidden it. It felt colder than ever, its rusted surface somehow heavier, as though it fought against what I was about to do. I tightened my grip defiantly. When I turned back, Ethan stared wide-eyed toward the window, trembling. Rebecca's ghostly figure was watching us, her lips silently mouthing threats as darkness seemed to drip from her hollow eyes. "Stay close," I instructed, pulling Ethan tightly beside me as we cautiously stepped back outside. The yard was unnaturally cold, frost covering the grass even though it was midsummer. Rebecca waited, standing between us and the open hole in the ground, her form shifting and flickering like a candle flame fighting the wind. "You can't stop me," she whispered mockingly, voice echoing impossibly from every direction. I knew it was now or never. Desperation drove me forward. Without hesitation, I shoved Ethan behind me and grabbed the shovel leaning against the house. My hands trembled, but I fought the fear down, plunging the box deep into the earth with frantic urgency. Rebecca shrieked, a hideous, bone-chilling sound of pure rage. Her ghostly fingers reached desperately toward me, but the ground itself seemed to pull her back, struggling to reclaim her. I shoveled dirt as quickly as possible, each scoop weakening her hold on our world. The shadows around us pulsed and shifted angrily, clawing toward Ethan as I worked. "Hurry, Dad!" Ethan screamed, his voice strained with terror. My muscles burned, adrenaline and fear driving me forward. The earth shook violently, knocking me to my knees, but I refused to stop. Rebecca's agonized screams filled the air, deafening and heart-wrenching, echoing across the neighborhood. With a final, determined heave, I threw the last shovel of dirt atop the hole, sealing the box back beneath the earth. At once, silence descended heavily around us. For a brief moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, Rebecca began to fade, her form collapsing inward like smoke pulled into a vacuum. Her black, empty eyes fixed upon me, filled with hate and endless hunger. "You'll never escape," she hissed softly. "I'll always be here." With one last, soul-piercing scream, Rebecca vanished completely, the unnatural chill lifting instantly. Ethan collapsed into my arms, shaking and sobbing with relief. For a long while, we remained there, holding each other in the silence. Above us, dawn was breaking, washing away the night's horrors with soft, golden light. But even as daylight slowly returned, I knew Margaret had been right. This was not over. I hugged Ethan tighter, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. The box was buried, but something deep inside warned me that the darkness beneath our house might never truly rest. The days after that terrible night were strangely peaceful, though it never truly felt right. Silence had returned to our home, but it wasn't the comforting quiet of safety. It was the unsettling silence of something hiding just beyond sight. Ethan seemed to bounce back quickly, as only a child could. He stopped mentioning Rebecca, his smile slowly returned, and the haunted look gradually faded from his eyes. To my relief, his drawings of the shadowy girl vanished from his sketchbook. Eventually, he even began sleeping peacefully through the night. Still, I found no peace. Each morning, driven by lingering dread, I walked cautiously to the backyard, carefully inspecting the spot where I had reburied the box. Every day, the soil remained undisturbed, untouched by anything unnatural. Grass grew back, slowly erasing the ugly scar we'd left behind, as though the earth itself wanted to forget what lay beneath. But no matter how normal things appeared, a voice inside continued to whisper doubts. Had I buried it deeply enough? Had Margaret been right? Was it really over? Despite these lingering fears, life slowly regained its normal rhythm. Days passed uneventfully, one blending seamlessly into another, yet my anxiety refused to subside entirely. I still woke at odd hours, startled by imaginary footsteps or whispers carried on the wind. Each time, I'd carefully inspect the backyard, flashlight trembling in my hand. Yet every time, the soil remained untouched, perfectly calm and undisturbed. Until one night changed everything again. I was startled awake by an overwhelming sense of dread, though nothing appeared obviously wrong. Instinctively, I hurried down the hall toward Ethan's bedroom, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. Ethan slept peacefully, breathing gently beneath the covers, bathed in the soft moonlight filtering through his curtains. For a moment, relief washed over me. Then my gaze fell onto the bedside table. A small, unfamiliar object rested there, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. With trembling fingers, I picked it up, immediately recognizing the ornate silver locket, the one engraved with the name Rebecca. My blood ran cold. The locket had been buried deep beneath the earth, yet here it was, impossibly clean and shining. Trembling, I opened it. Inside was a fresh photograph, a photograph that hadn't been there before. My heart nearly stopped. It was Ethan, smiling innocently, unaware of the nightmare he was caught in. Suddenly, the room filled with a faint, chilling breeze. I spun around, eyes darting wildly into the shadows, searching for something, anything, to explain how this was possible. Then, from the darkest corner, the silence shattered as a voice whispered clearly and maliciously through the room, echoing through my very bones. "You didn't bury me deep enough." My legs nearly buckled beneath me, the photograph slipping from my fingers and fluttering to the floor. Behind me, Ethan stirred slightly in his sleep, unaware of the horror unfolding around us. I stood frozen, staring into the dark corner where something moved subtly, the shadows growing thicker, colder, alive. The peace we thought we'd reclaimed was merely an illusion, a fragile veneer hiding an evil far older and deeper than I'd imagined. Rebecca had returned, and I knew now, with chilling certainty, she would never truly leave. This was her home, not ours, and the box had only been the beginning. When Ryan and I moved to Millhaven, we thought we were escaping the noise, the stress, and the cold indifference of city life. Our new home sat on the edge of town, a charming two-story house with a white picket fence and a front porch big enough for morning coffee and late-night talks. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other on the streets, where the local bakery knew your name by the second visit, and where life seemed to slow down just enough to feel real again. Ryan had always dreamed of a quiet town like this. His job in software development allowed him to work remotely, and I was still figuring things out. Moving here was meant to be a fresh start for both of us, a chance to breathe, to reconnect, to build something new together. Millhaven welcomed us with open arms. Neighbors stopped by with homemade pies, asking about our lives, sharing stories about the town. There was a warmth to this place, a sense of belonging that felt almost too good to be true. A week after settling in, we were invited to the town's monthly gathering at the community hall, a tradition, they said, to keep everyone close. It was a lively event, filled with laughter, music, and home-cooked food that tasted like something out of my grandmother's kitchen. That's where I met him. Lucas, tall, dark-haired, with an easy smile and an energy that drew people in without effort. He was the kind of man you'd notice in a crowd, not just because of his looks, but because he had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he spoke to you. He introduced himself casually, shaking Ryan's hand first before turning to me. "Emily, right? Welcome to Millhaven," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. His eyes locked onto mine just a little too long. His smile was warm, yet something about it made my skin prickle. I smiled politely. "Thank you. It's a lovely town." He nodded. "It is. People take care of each other here." There was something in the way he said it, like it was more than just a friendly statement, like it was a warning. Ryan excused himself to chat with one of our neighbors, leaving me alone with Lucas. He asked about the move, about my life before Millhaven, about my thoughts on the town. He was charming, engaging, and yet there was something off. His eyes lingered when I spoke, his body angled just slightly too close. The way he said my name, slow, deliberate, felt almost intimate. By the time Ryan returned, I was relieved. Lucas gave me one last lingering glance before flashing that same easy smile and disappearing into the crowd. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overthinking, reading too much into a simple conversation. But as the night wore on, I felt it, the weight of eyes on me. And every time I turned, Lucas was there, watching, smiling. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. The first time I saw Lucas after the town gathering, I was at the grocery store, absently browsing the shelves. He appeared at the end of the aisle, flashing that familiar, easy smile. "Emily," he greeted me, as if he had been expecting me, settling in well. I nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Yeah, I think so." He glanced into my basket. "You like chamomile tea?" I frowned. "How did you? You mentioned it at the gathering." He shrugged. "I have a good memory." It was such a small detail. Insignificant, really, but something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. The second time I ran into him, I was at the local coffee shop. I had been hoping for a quiet moment to myself, but as I stepped inside, there he was, sitting near the window, a book in his hands. He looked up, grinned, and motioned toward the empty seat across from him. "Fancy meeting you here," he said smoothly. I hesitated, then sat. It felt rude not to. Besides, he was friendly, harmless. We talked about books, about life in Millhaven. His words were charming, his attention intoxicating. He remembered things I had barely noticed I'd shared. The way I liked my coffee. The fact that I jogged in the mornings near Willow Creek. "Maybe I'll join you sometime," he said, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. I'm pretty slow. The next morning, he was there. I had just started my jog when I spotted him up ahead, stretching casually as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Morning, Emily," he said, falling into stride beside me. A thrill ran through me, one I wasn't sure I wanted to acknowledge. For days, it continued, running into him at random places. Subtle compliments, lingering glances, conversations that dipped just slightly too personal. I should have put a stop to it. But the truth? I liked the attention. Ryan was wonderful, but lately, he had been distant, buried in his work. We barely talked beyond the usual pleasantries. Lucas, on the other hand, looked at me like I was the only person in the world. He made me feel seen, desired in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that was dangerous. The Millhaven Summer Festival was supposed to be a fun distraction. Ryan had promised to go with me, but at the last minute, he was caught up in meetings. "Go without me," he said, kissing my cheek absently. "Have fun." I went, telling myself I didn't care. The town square was alive with music, laughter, twinkling lights strung between the trees. People danced in the warm evening air, the scent of roasted sugar almonds thick around us. And then, Lucas found me. "Guess your husband's not much for festivals," he said, appearing beside me with that same easy confidence. "He's busy," I muttered, ignoring the heat in my cheeks. Lucas studied me for a moment, then extended his hand. "Dance with me." I should have said no. I should have walked away. Instead, I let him pull me onto the dance floor. His hands were firm but gentle as we swayed to the music. The warmth of his body, the way his fingers lingered against mine, it was intoxicating. My heart pounded in a way that had nothing to do with the music. "You're beautiful, Emily," he murmured. And then, before I could stop it, his lips brushed against mine. For one foolish, breathless moment, I let it happen. Then reality crashed down. I pushed him away, my breath ragged. "No, I can't do this." Lucas's eyes darkened, but instead of anger, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "This isn't over," he whispered. A chill ran through me. I turned and walked away, my stomach twisting with regret. But as I slipped through the crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes still on me. Watching, waiting. The next morning, I opened the front door and froze. A bouquet of red roses sat on the doorstep. Deep crimson, their petals fresh with morning dew. The kind of flowers meant for lovers. Tucked between them was a small note. "Until next time." My hands trembled as I picked it up. There was no name, but I didn't need one. I knew who had sent them. I glanced over my shoulder, heart pounding. The street was quiet, the neighborhood still wrapped in the sleepy haze of early morning. Ryan was upstairs in his office, already on a call. He hadn't seen the flowers. I should have thrown them away, should have told him. But instead, I snatched them up, rushed inside, and shoved them deep into the trash bin. Out of sight, out of mind. Or so I told myself. I avoided Lucas after that. I changed my jogging route. I stopped going to the coffee shop. I skipped the usual grocery run, sending Ryan instead. I wanted distance. Needed it. But it didn't matter. Lucas was always there. One afternoon, I stepped out of the pharmacy, and there he was, leaning against a lamppost, sipping from a takeaway cup. "Emily," he greeted smoothly, as if nothing had happened, as if that kiss hadn't changed everything. I forced a tense smile. "Lucas." He didn't move, didn't acknowledge the way my body stiffened. "You've been busy. Haven't seen you around." "I've just had things to do." I lied. He nodded, studying me in a way that made my stomach twist. Then, with a lazy smile, he said, "Well, I'll see you around." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. Then the messages started. At first, they were simple. "Unknown number. You look beautiful today." I deleted it immediately. The next day, "Unknown number. I miss our talks." Then, "Unknown number. Do you think about me too?" I blocked the number. But more kept coming. Always from a new one. Always brief. Always just enough to make my skin crawl. I told myself I was overreacting. That Lucas would get bored. That if I ignored him long enough, he would stop. But then, at Sunday service, I saw him. Ryan and I sat in our usual pew, the warm hum of the organ filling the church. I bowed my head, trying to focus on the sermon, to drown out the anxious thoughts swirling in my mind. Then I felt it. A gaze. I looked up, and there he was, sitting across the church, watching me. His eyes locked onto mine, and slowly, so slowly, he smiled. A knowing, patient smile, like he had all the time in the world. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned away, gripping Ryan's hand, my knuckles white. For the first time since moving to Millhaven, I didn't feel safe. Not even in my own home. It was past 9 when I left the market, my canvas bags heavy with groceries. The parking lot was nearly empty, the overhead lights humming faintly in the crisp night air. I juggled the bags in one hand while fishing my keys from my pocket. Then I stopped. My stomach lurched. My car sat in the same spot I had left it, but something was wrong. The front left tire, flat. No, not just flat. Slashed. A jagged tear ran through the rubber, deliberate, violent. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. I spun around, scanning the lot. Empty. Silent. But that didn't mean I was alone. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with panic. I could call Ryan. I could call the police. But what would I say? That someone had slashed my tire? That I thought it was him? Lucas. I didn't have proof. Just a feeling. And somehow, I knew that was exactly what he wanted. The package arrived 2 days later. A small, nondescript cardboard box sitting on our front porch. No return address. No markings. Ryan was upstairs, still buried in work. I hesitated, then picked it up, my breath catching as I lifted the lid. Inside was something small, delicate. An earring. My earring. I hadn't even realized it was missing. I had worn them weeks ago, a simple gold pair I loved, then assumed I had lost one somewhere in town. But here it was, inside a box, inside my home. I staggered back, my vision swimming. Lucas had been inside. Somehow, at some point, he had been in my house. Close enough to take something of mine. Close enough to let me know, without a doubt, that he could come back anytime he wanted. I found him the next afternoon. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't planning. I just saw him, standing outside the coffee shop, chatting with a couple of locals like nothing was wrong. And something inside me snapped. I stormed toward him, my breath coming fast. He looked up just as I reached him, his lips curling into that familiar smirk. "Emily, stop it," I hissed, my voice low but shaking with fury. He raised an eyebrow. "Stop what?" I clenched my fists. The texts, the flowers, the car. I swallowed hard. The earring. Something flickered in his eyes, amusement. Like this was a game to him. His smirk widened. "I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you just miss me." My nails dug into my palms. "I swear to God, if you come near me again." "What?" He tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "What will you do, Emily?" My throat closed up. He knew. He knew I wouldn't tell Ryan. That I wouldn't go to the police with nothing but my suspicions. He knew I was trapped. And he liked it. I turned and walked away, my entire body trembling. Behind me, I heard his voice, soft, teasing. "I'll see you around." Ryan noticed my silence that night. We sat on the couch, the television flickering in the background, but I wasn't watching. I was staring at my hands, still hearing Lucas's voice in my head. Ryan shifted beside me. "Emily, what's wrong?" I forced a smile. "Nothing, just tired." He studied me, concern etched into his face. "You've been different lately." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I'm just stressed. Adjusting to a new place, you know." Ryan squeezed my hand. "You can tell me anything." I almost did. I almost told him everything. But then I thought of the earring, of Lucas's smirk, of the way he had so easily twisted reality, making it seem like I was the one imagining things. And I stayed silent. The sound woke me. A faint noise, just loud enough to pull me from sleep. A soft creak, the kind of floorboard makes when someone steps too hard. I lay frozen in the darkness, my breath shallow. The house was quiet, except for the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. But something was wrong. Then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate shuffle. Someone was inside. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I turned to Ryan, my fingers shaking as I nudged his shoulder. "Ryan," I whispered. "Wake up." He groaned, shifting. "What's wrong?" "There's someone downstairs." That woke him. He sat up instantly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Are you sure?" I nodded, my throat dry. For a moment, we just sat there, listening. Silence. But I knew what I had heard. Ryan got up, reaching under the bed. He pulled out the wooden baseball bat he had kept there since we moved in, just in case. "Stay behind me," he murmured. We crept toward the staircase, my heart pounding so loudly I swore whoever was downstairs could hear it. The floor was cold beneath my bare feet. Every step felt impossibly slow, the air thick with the kind of tension that made my skin crawl. Then we reached the bottom. Ryan flicked on the kitchen light. I gasped. The window above the sink was shattered, jagged glass littering the countertop. Cold night air slithered through the opening, rustling the curtains. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. There, on the refrigerator, a piece of paper was taped to the door. The message was scrawled in red ink. Bold, uneven. "You're mine." I clamped a hand over my mouth. Ryan's jaw tightened, his grip on the bat turning white-knuckled. "Call the police," he said. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. My fingers barely worked as I dialed. The wait for the officers felt like a lifetime. When they finally arrived, they swept through the house, checking every room, every closet. But whoever had been here was already gone. I tried to tell them. I told them about Lucas, about the notes, the texts, the way he always seemed to be one step ahead. One of the officers, a man in his 40s with tired eyes, exchanged glances with his partner. Then he sighed. "There's no proof it was him," he said. Ryan bristled. "Are you kidding me? He broke into our house and left a threat." The officer glanced at the note. "There are no fingerprints. No forced entry besides the window. No security footage. He shifted, then added, "Honestly, it could have been local kids messing around. We get a few pranksters every now and then." A prank. I swallowed, my stomach twisting. This wasn't a prank. This was a warning. But the police couldn't do anything without evidence. I stood there, numb, barely hearing their reassurances that they'd keep an eye on things, that they'd patrol the area more often. It didn't matter. I knew the truth. Lucas had been inside my home, and he wasn't going to stop. Ryan left that morning for a work trip. He kissed me goodbye at the door, his bags already packed in the car. "I'll only be gone 2 nights," he reassured me, cupping my face. "You'll be okay?" I forced a smile, not wanting to worry him. Of course. But as I watched his car disappear down the street, unease settled deep in my stomach. The moment he was gone, I locked every door and window in the house. Then I checked them again, and again. That night, I kept a knife by my bed. The storm rolled in just after midnight. Thunder rattled the windows, the wind howling through the trees outside. Rain pounded against the roof in heavy sheets. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my grip tight around the handle of the knife. Every creak of the house made my breath hitch, every distant rumble of thunder making me flinch. Then, the lights went out. A sharp crack outside, then total darkness. I sat up, my heart hammering. The power was gone. Just the storm, I told myself. Just bad timing. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The dim glow barely cut through the blackness. Candles. I needed candles. I swung my legs over the bed and crept toward the nightstand, trying to steady my breathing. I had left a small box of matches in the drawer. If I could just. Then I heard it. A soft creak. A floorboard groaning. Upstairs. I froze. I was alone. Wasn't I? Another creak. Closer this time. My breath hitched. My mind raced. Then, a whisper. Low. Gentle. "Emily." The blood drained from my face. I turned toward the hallway, my phone's flashlight trembling in my grip. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the doorway for a split second. And I saw him. Lucas. Standing there. Watching me. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, his face calm. Too calm. His shirt was soaked from the rain, his hair clinging to his forehead. He took a slow step forward, his voice eerily soft. "We belong together, Emily." I stumbled back, my pulse slamming in my ears. How did you get in?" His smile never wavered. "You let me in a long time ago." Another step closer. "I won't let you go." I bolted. I didn't think, just ran. Down the hallway, through the living room, slamming the door behind me as I stumbled into the bathroom. I locked it, pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath. Silence. Then, a slow, steady knock. The doorknob rattled. Then a laugh. Soft, almost amused. The wood splintered. I screamed as the door shook under his weight. He was breaking it down. My eyes darted around the bathroom. Anything I could use. The mirror. With a desperate cry, I grabbed the glass soap dish and smashed it against the sink. Shards flew everywhere. I seized the largest piece, gripping it tight, not caring as it sliced into my palm. The door crashed open. Lucas lunged. I swung. The glass tore through his arm, deep and fast. He stumbled back with a hiss, his hand flying to the wound. His eyes darkened. "You shouldn't have done that," he murmured. He lunged again. Then, sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Tires screeched outside. Lucas's head snapped toward the sound. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression, surprise. Footsteps pounded up the porch. I gasped as the front door burst open, shouts filling the house. Lucas turned to run, but it was too late. 2 officers tackled him to the ground. He thrashed, shouting my name. His voice twisted with desperation. "Emily, tell them. We belong together." I pressed myself against the wall, shaking, unable to move, unable to breathe. One of the officers turned to me, his voice distant, muffled. "Ma'am, you're safe now." Safe. I sank to the floor, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. Lucas was screaming, fighting, but they dragged him away. Out of my house, out of my life. And as the rain poured outside, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was over. We left Millhaven a week later. Ryan didn't argue when I told him we had to go. He had seen the fear in my eyes, the way I flinched at every sound, the way I barely slept. The house no longer felt like home. It felt tainted, like the walls held shadows of him, of what had almost happened. So we packed up and moved to a new town, a new house, a new start. But the fear came with me. I checked the locks 5 times before bed. Every night. Every single window, every door, even the ones Ryan swore were already secured. I slept with the lights on. I jumped at the sound of my phone buzzing. I saw his face in every darkened alley, every passing stranger, every shadow stretching too long in the dim glow of the streetlights. I told myself I was safe, that he was gone, that it was over. Then, a news report. I hadn't meant to see it. It was just another morning, coffee in hand, flipping through the channels absent-mindedly, until his name stopped me cold. Lucas Carter, arrested stalker linked to multiple victims. The screen showed his mugshot, his dark eyes staring back at me, expression blank. Beneath his image, a reporter recounted the details. Lucas had been stalking women for years, moving from town to town, finding someone new, worming his way into their lives before things turned dark. Some had restraining orders. Some had left town, just like I had. Some hadn't been as lucky. My stomach twisted as they listed names. Women like me. Women who thought they had met a charming stranger. Women who never realized how deep the obsession ran, until it was too late. I turned off the TV, my hands trembling. I was relieved and horrified because I had come so close. Closer than I wanted to admit. That night, I finally slept. For the first time in weeks, I let myself believe that it was truly over, that he was behind bars, that he couldn't hurt me anymore. Until my phone rang. The sound yanked me from sleep, my heart pounding as I grabbed it off the nightstand. Blocked number. A cold chill ran down my spine. I hesitated. Then, slowly, I pressed accept and raised the phone to my ear. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep voice whispered, low and familiar, "I'll find you again." The call disconnected. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, my fingers numb, my body frozen. Outside, the night stretched on, dark and endless. And as I sat there, trapped in a waking nightmare, I realized the truth. Some nightmares don't end, even when the monster is behind bars. I always believed that fear was something you could rationalize. That if you told yourself there was nothing to be afraid of, eventually, you'd believe it. But that weekend in the forest changed everything. It started like every other trip. Every year, my friends and I had a tradition. One weekend in the wild. No phones, no distractions, just nature and each other. This time, we had chosen a remote camping spot deep in the heart of Blackwood National Forest. A place so isolated it didn't even appear on most maps. It was perfect, or so we thought. The 5 of us, Chris, Megan, Nate, Olivia, and I, piled into Nate's Jeep early Friday morning, our backpack stuffed with supplies, sleeping bags, and enough beer to last the weekend. We were ready for an escape from the world. The drive took longer than expected, mostly because the last few miles were little more than a dirt path cutting through an endless stretch of trees. No signs, no cabins, not even another car. Just us and the wilderness. "This place is giving me serious Blair Witch vibes," Megan joked as we unloaded the gear. I chuckled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the silence. Even in a forest this deep, you'd expect to hear birds, insects, something. But there was nothing. No wind rustling the leaves. No distant animal calls. Just stillness. "I swear, Daniel," Olivia smirked, nudging me. "You're looking at the trees like they're about to start talking." I forced a laugh, just taking it all in. She rolled her eyes, the skeptic of the group as always. "Yeah, well, let's get the tent up before dark." We got to work setting up camp. It was simple, one large tent, a fire pit, and a makeshift area for cooking. As the sun dipped below the treetops, the uneasy feeling settled in my chest again. I told myself I was imagining things. I was wrong. As we settled into camp, my unease only grew. The silence wasn't just unsettling, it was wrong. A forest this deep should be alive with sounds. The chatter of birds, the rustling of small animals, the distant hum of insects. But there was nothing, just an eerie, suffocating stillness, like the whole place was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it as we worked. Nate gathered firewood while Megan and Olivia unpacked the food. Chris, always the self-proclaimed survival expert, was fussing with the tent poles, insisting he could get it set up faster than the rest of us combined. That was when I heard it. A sound drifted through the trees, faint, distant, almost swallowed by the thick air. A scream. It was quick, barely more than a sharp, high-pitched wail carried on the wind. But it wasn't an animal. I knew that instantly. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. "Did you hear that?" Megan asked, straightening up. Chris scoffed. "Relax, it's probably just a mountain lion or something. They make those kinds of sounds, right?" Megan shot him a glare. That did not sound like a mountain lion. Olivia shook her head. If it was a person, it was probably just some hiker messing around. Maybe a couple drunk idiots having fun. But something about the sound. It had been too sharp, too desperate. I glanced at the others, waiting to see if anyone else felt the same creeping dread that was tightening in my chest. "We should check it out," Megan said, brushing her hands on her jeans. Nate frowned. "And do what? Wander around the woods at dusk looking for a random noise?" He gestured at the trees. "Come on, we barely made it here without getting lost. Last thing we need is to go playing detective." For a moment, we stood there in silence, listening. But the scream didn't come again. Eventually, Olivia sighed. "If it happens again, we'll figure it out. For now, let's just eat." Reluctantly, Megan agreed, and we went back to setting up camp. But my hands felt clumsy, my movements slower than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees. Later that night, we sat around the campfire, passing around beers and trying to shake the unease. Chris told some dumb story about his disastrous attempt at deep-sea fishing last summer, and for a little while, things almost felt normal. Almost, but I couldn't fully relax. The silence still pressed in around us, heavy and unnatural. Even the crackling fire felt muted, like the whole forest was swallowing the sound. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see something moving in the darkness. Then it came again, another scream. Only this time, it was closer. The second scream shattered any illusion of normalcy. It was closer now, cutting through the night like a jagged blade. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't some distant animal call or a group of hikers playing around. This was human, and whoever it was, they were in trouble. For a moment, no one spoke. We just sat there, the fire crackling weakly between us, our faces painted with flickering shadows. Megan was the first to stand. "Okay, we have to check that out." Chris groaned. "Are we really doing this?" "We can't just sit here," she shot back. "What if someone's hurt?" Nate sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is how horror movies start, guys." "Yeah, and they start that way because people ignore the obvious signs," Megan argued. "Look, we're not going to go wandering blind. We take a couple flashlights, stay together, and go in a straight line. If it looks sketchy, we turn back. Simple." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Olivia grabbed her flashlight and clicked it on. "Fine, but if this turns out to be nothing, I get to say I told you so for the rest of the trip." One by one, we picked up our flashlights. Nate pulled a hunting knife from his backpack. "Just in case," he muttered. I wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure himself or the rest of us. We set off, our footsteps crunching against the dry leaves as we moved away from the fire and into the trees. The deeper we went, the more unnatural everything felt. The air was too still. No wind, no rustling branches, no chirping insects. Just our own breathing and the faint hum of our flashlights. The trees seemed wrong, like they were leaning in, watching, their gnarled limbs tangled together overhead, swallowing what little moonlight tried to push through. I kept my eyes on the ground, half hoping, half dreading that we'd find something. And then we did. "Hold up," Olivia said, stopping short. In the weak glow of our flashlights, a torn piece of fabric clung to a low-hanging branch. It was dark, almost black under the night sky, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was stained with something. Blood. Dried, crusted, but unmistakable. Megan swallowed hard. That's not a good sign. Chris exhaled sharply. Okay, I vote we turn back right now. Before anyone could answer, Nate pointed his flashlight a few feet ahead. Guys, look. We followed his beam of light. A shoe. A single, battered sneaker half buried in the dirt, its laces still knotted tight. Next to it, the undergrowth was disturbed. Twigs snapped, leaves scattered, as if something or someone had been dragged. I felt a cold knot twist in my stomach. Something wasn't right, I whispered. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was a trail leading us somewhere. We followed the broken trail of twigs and disturbed leaves, our flashlights cutting thin beams through the suffocating darkness. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into something we weren't meant to find. The forest seemed to be closing in, the trees pressing tighter together, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. The silence was unbearable, as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Then, without warning, the trees parted into a clearing. The space was unervingly symmetrical, a perfect circle where no undergrowth grew, the earth smoothed, unnaturally bare. My first thought was that it had been cleared on purpose. My second thought, what kind of purpose? At the center stood a massive stone altar. It was old, weathered, covered in deep, intricate carvings that spiraled in unnatural patterns. Strange symbols, ones I didn't recognize, had been etched into its surface, fresh blood dripping into the grooves. The air around it felt wrong, heavy, thick, like something unseen was pressing against my chest. My flashlight flickered. Megan clapped a hand over her mouth, stifling a gasp. The trees around the clearing weren't untouched either. Symbols had been burned into their bark, crude and jagged, like they had been carved with shaking hands. The marks weren't random. They formed a pattern, something too deliberate to be meaningless. This is a ritual site, Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. We need to leave. Now. I turned to agree, to say that we needed to turn around and run. But then they stepped out from the shadows. Figures, tall, robed, hooded, moving without sound, emerging from the darkness like they had been waiting for us. They moved in perfect silence, their faces obscured by deep hoods, their hands hidden within the folds of heavy fabric. They surrounded us. My heart slammed against my ribs as I gripped my flashlight like it could be a weapon. Nate tightened his hold on the hunting knife, but I could see the tremor in his fingers. Then, from the darkness, a single figure stepped forward. Unlike the others, he did not wear a hood. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, his face gaunt, his features sharp and unnaturally pale. His eyes were piercingly blue, too bright against the sickly glow of the moon. But it was his smile that sent ice through my veins. It was not threatening. It was welcoming, like we had arrived exactly where we were meant to be. You heard the call, he said, his voice smooth, disturbingly calm. The gods demand sacrifice. No one moved. No one breathed. Then it hit me. We had walked straight into a trap. The moment the words left the old man's lips, the cultists moved. They were fast. Too fast. 1 second, they were standing still, silent as the trees around them. The next, they were upon us. Nate was the first to react, swinging his knife in a desperate arc. His blade caught one of them in the arm, slicing through the fabric of their robe. But before he could strike again, another figure lunged from behind. A flash of silver. A sickening thud. Nate's scream tore through the clearing as the blade plunged deep into his thigh. He crumpled to the ground, his hands clutching his leg, blood spilling between his fingers. Nate! Megan shrieked, trying to run to him. But they grabbed her, 3 of them at once, yanking her back, hands clamping over her mouth. I spun, heart hammering, trying to find an opening, any chance to run. But there was none. The cultists closed in from all sides, their robes moving like shadows, swallowing us whole. A pair of hands wrenched my arms behind my back. I kicked out, struggling, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My flashlight fell from my grip, its beams spinning wildly before crashing against the altar and plunging the clearing into deeper darkness. Chris was yelling, his voice raw with panic. Olivia thrashed in their grip, her terrified sobs cutting through the night. "Let us go," I roared, my voice shaking. "What the hell do you want?" The old man approached, stepping over Nate's writhing body like he was nothing more than a fallen branch. His unnatural smile never wavered. His voice was calm, patient, inevitable. "It's not about what we want," he said softly. "It's about what they demand." Before I could process his words, a sharp prick stung my neck. I barely registered the syringe, the cold liquid burning beneath my skin. My vision blurred, my knees buckling. My limbs felt heavy, my body refusing to listen. No, I had to fight. The world tilted, spinning in slow motion, shadows stretching and twisting. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Nate, still bleeding in the dirt. And that sickening smile. I woke to the smell of rot and smoke. Thick, damp air clung to my skin, heavy with the stench of mildew, sweat, and something worse. My head pounded, my body sluggish, like I was wading through molasses. I tried to move. Rope bit into my wrists and ankles, coarse fibers scraping against raw skin. I was bound tightly, my arms twisted behind me, my legs pinned together. The cold stone beneath me was slick, damp. My cheek rested against the rough surface, the sharp scent of blood and dirt filling my nostrils. I forced my eyes open. The chamber was dimly lit, torches flickering in rusted iron brackets along the walls. The flames cast long, shifting shadows, making everything seem alive. The walls themselves weren't smooth like a cave. They were carved, ancient symbols etched into the stone, their meaning lost to time. And then I saw the bones. Skulls, rib cages, scattered along the walls like grotesque decorations. Some were small, too small. My stomach lurched as my mind registered what I was seeing. These weren't just animal remains. I swallowed hard, forcing the bile back down. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. A low groan caught my attention. Chris was slumped nearby, still unconscious, his head lolled to one side. Olivia sat against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, her shoulders trembling. Nate lay flat on his back, his face ghostly pale, his leg hastily wrapped in some kind of makeshift bandage. His breathing was shallow. My voice came out hoarse. "Olivia." She looked up, eyes wide, tear-streaked. "Daniel." Her voice cracked. "We have to get out of here." "They." She choked on a sob, shaking her head violently. "Megan." I rasped, throat dry. "Where's Megan?" Her lower lip trembled. And then we heard it. A scream. Megan's voice. Muffled, distant, coming from somewhere beyond the chamber. A wail of raw terror, of pain, echoing off the stone walls. Chris stirred, his face twisting in confusion as he came to. Nate barely reacted. Olivia let out a strangled sob. The screaming continued, growing weaker, more desperate. I struggled against the ropes, panic thrumming through my veins. "We have to move. We have to get to her." But deep down, I already knew. We were too late. Megan's screams faded into the distance, swallowed by the thick stone walls. I didn't want to think about what was happening to her. I couldn't. If I let myself dwell on it, I'd lose control, and we couldn't afford that. I twisted my wrists, ignoring the sting as the ropes bit deeper into my skin. The knots were tight, but not perfect. Whoever tied them hadn't expected us to fight back. My fingers strained, searching for any slack, any weakness. Across from me, Olivia sat frozen, her face streaked with tears. "We have to do something," I whispered, keeping my voice low. "Nate, how bad is it?" She swallowed hard, glancing at him. "He's barely holding on." I clenched my jaw. We had to get out of here now. Chris stirred, groaning as he finally came to. He blinked against the dim light, disoriented, before his expression hardened. "Where the hell are we?" "No time," I muttered. "Try the door." He nodded and scrambled toward it, his hands fumbling over the rough wooden surface. No handle, no lock, just heavy iron hinges bolted into the stone. He pressed against it, testing its weight. Damn thing solid. "Find something. Anything to cut us loose," I hissed. Olivia's eyes darted around the room before landing on a jagged rock near the base of the wall. She snatched it up, her hands shaking. "Hold still." She worked quickly, sawing through my bindings. Every scrape sent a jolt of pain up my wrists, but I gritted my teeth and let her work. Footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond the door. Heavy, steady, coming closer. Chris tensed, stepping back from the door. Olivia froze mid-cut, her breath catching in her throat. I hissed, "Hurry." The rope snapped. I barely had time to shake the stiffness from my arms before the door creaked open. A single cultist stepped inside, his hood drawn low over his face, the dim torchlight casting deep shadows across his features. He carried a rusted dagger at his side, his grip firm, practiced. His gaze swept over us, lingering on Nate's barely conscious form. He took a slow step forward. That was all I needed. I lunged. My shoulder slammed into his chest, knocking him off balance. He staggered, but he was strong, too strong. His fingers closed around my throat, squeezing. Chris tackled him from the side, sending us all crashing to the floor. Olivia screamed. The cultist snarled, trying to twist free, but I pried his fingers from my neck and drove my knee into his ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. That second was enough. Chris grabbed a rock from the floor and brought it down on the back of the cultist's head with a sickening crack. The man went limp. For a moment, we were all frozen, panting, our own ragged breathing the only sound in the chamber. Then Olivia lunged forward, yanking the dagger from the cultist's belt with shaking hands. "The door," she gasped. "We have to go now." Chris fumbled with the latch, prying at it with the blade. The metal creaked, then gave way. The door swung open. The corridor beyond was dark, stretching into the unknown. But we had no choice. We ran. The corridor stretched before us, twisting and turning like a living thing, its stone walls damp with moisture, the air thick with decay. The torches lining the walls flickered weakly, barely holding back the choking darkness. Chris led the way, dagger clenched in his hand. Olivia stayed close behind, supporting Nate as best she could. I gripped the stolen torch, my pulse hammering in my ears. Megan's screams had stopped. I didn't know if that was better or worse. We moved quickly, our footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath us. The tunnel branched off in different directions, but something, some unseen force, was pulling us forward, like the path had already been decided for us. Then we heard it, chanting, low, rhythmic, in a language that sent a chill down my spine. The sound reverberated off the walls, growing louder with each step. We rounded a final corner and froze. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, larger than anything I'd expected. The ceiling arched impossibly high, vanishing into darkness. Torches lined the walls, their flames casting eerie shadows over the carved symbols that covered every inch of stone. Unlike the markings in our cell, these glowed, a sickly, pulsating red, as if the rock itself was alive. And at the center of it all, Megan. She was tied to a massive altar, her wrists bound with thick rope, her body struggling weakly against the restraints. Her mouth was gagged, but her eyes, wide, terrified, locked onto mine the moment we entered. Surrounding her, the cultists stood in a perfect circle, their chanting rising in intensity. Their leader stood at the head of the altar, ceremonial dagger raised high. But it wasn't just the cultists. Something else was in the room. It began as a ripple in the air, a distortion above the altar, as if reality itself was unraveling. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, casting the chamber in blood-red light. And then it descended, a monstrous entity, shifting, formless, its body writhing like living smoke. Limbs extended from its shifting mass, too many to count, each one stretching unnaturally long. Its skin, if it even had skin, was an abyss, absorbing light, making the surrounding darkness seem brighter by contrast. Eyes, deep, hollow voids, burned within its shifting form, each one locking onto Megan as it reached for her. The cultists chanted louder. The air vibrated. Megan screamed as the very air around her seemed to warp, distorting like heat rising from pavement. I didn't think. I acted. I surged forward, gripping the torch tight, and swung it against the altar. The dry wood and cloth caught instantly, flames licking up the side. The chamber exploded into chaos. The cultist shrieked, stumbling back as fire devoured the altar. The leader turned toward me, his serene expression cracking into fury. Chris and Olivia lunged, tackling the nearest cultists, their shouts lost in the uproar. Olivia snatched another dagger from one of them and drove it into a robed figure's side. The entity recoiled from the flames, its form twisting, writhing, its limbs snapping back as if the fire was poisoned. Megan's restraints burned away. She tumbled off the altar, coughing, her arms flailing as she struggled to stand. "Run!" I screamed, but the leader wasn't done. Through the smoke and chaos, I saw his gaze lock onto me, his piercing blue eyes alight with something beyond rage, something inhuman. And then he smiled. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Megan's arm and pulling her toward the exit. The chamber erupted in chaos, the cultist shouting, the monstrous entity shrieking, its voice like tearing metal. The air itself rippled, vibrating with an unnatural force. The fire on the altar spread quickly, casting wild shadows against the cavern walls. Chris, Olivia, and Nate were already moving, stumbling toward the tunnel we had come through. But as we ran, the leader's voice rose above the chaos, cold and commanding. "They do not leave." The cultists surged forward. We bolted down the tunnel, our footsteps pounding against the damp stone. The flickering torchlight behind us cast our shadows long and distorted, stretching against the walls like twisted monsters. And then the thing moved. It didn't chase us in the way a living thing should. It pulsed, its form collapsing and reforming, appearing closer each time the torches flickered. The walls trembled as it moved, the symbols glowing brighter, as if the entire forest was alive, aware, hunting us. We reached the exit, bursting into the open air of the woods. But something was wrong. The trees were different. The path we had taken to the underground chamber was gone. The forest had shifted, twisted in ways that defied logic. The trees leaned in, their trunks gnarled and spiraling unnaturally, their branches tangled like grasping fingers. Chris was ahead, flashlight bobbing as he ran, but then he vanished. 1 second he was there, the next gone. No sound, no scream, just gone, like the forest had swallowed him whole. "Chris!" Olivia shouted, but there was no answer. The cultists were behind us now, their robed figures darting through the trees, impossibly fast. Olivia turned to run, but she stumbled. I turned just in time to see her fall behind, arms flailing. Her scream cut short as something yanked her into the trees. Her flashlight spun wildly, then stopped. The forest was silent again. Megan gasped, pulling me forward. "Daniel, don't stop." Nate was still with us, limping, his breathing ragged. The entity shrieked behind us. I didn't look back. I just ran. Nate stumbled, his wounded leg giving out. He hit the ground hard, coughing, blood soaking through his jeans. "Nate, get up!" Megan cried, trying to pull him. But his face was pale, his hands shaking. I can't." The trees trembled, the air warped. Nate's eyes widened. "Go!" Megan shook her head violently. "No, we can't." "Gio!" he roared, shoving her away. A deep, guttural growl rose behind us, impossibly close. Megan sobbed, but I grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. Nate was still breathing when we left him behind. The ground beneath us sloped upward, and suddenly, the trees thinned. And then we saw them. Headlights. A road. Real, solid, salvation. Megan sobbed in relief. We ran, pushing our broken bodies forward, toward the road, toward escape. But the forest wasn't finished with us yet, because as we reached the edge of the trees, the headlights flickered, and then they went out. The headlights flickered back on. A truck barreled down the road, its tires humming against the asphalt. I stumbled forward, waving my arms frantically. Megan did the same, her voice hoarse as she screamed for help. The driver slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop just a few feet away. The door swung open, and a man stepped out, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "What the hell? Please!" I gasped. "Help us!" Megan clutched my arm, shaking violently. Behind us, the forest loomed, dark and impenetrable. The man hesitated for only a second before nodding. Get in. We didn't need to be told twice. The police didn't believe us. They found nothing. No clearing. No altar. No underground chamber. The place where we had been held, the tunnels, the symbols, the bones, was gone. Chris, Olivia, and Nate had vanished without a trace. Their footprints disappeared at the tree line. No sign of a struggle. No blood. Nothing. It was as if they had never existed at all. Megan and I told them everything. About the cult. About the sacrifice. About the thing that had come from Megan. The officers exchanged looks. Trauma-induced hysteria, they called it. Survivor's guilt. They asked us if we'd been drinking. If we'd taken anything. I wanted to scream at them. But what could I say? Even I couldn't explain it. Megan left town. She didn't say goodbye. One day, she just disappeared. Deleted her number. No social media. No way to reach her. I don't blame her. Some things you don't recover from. I tried to go back to my life. I told myself it was over. That it wasn't real. That maybe the police were right. Maybe we had imagined it. Maybe it was some bizarre, collective nightmare. Something our minds had twisted in the dark. But at night, I hear things. Footsteps outside my window. A low, whispering chant, barely audible. And sometimes, when I wake up, there's a symbol carved into my wall. A symbol I've seen before. A symbol that glows in the dark. The dirt road stretched endlessly before us, winding through dense trees that seemed to press in from all sides. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, glancing at Claire beside me. She had her phone in her lap, the screen displaying the directions to the cabin. No signal. Are we sure this is the right place? Jake muttered from the back seat. He was leaning forward, peering through the windshield at the rough, narrow path. It has to be, Claire said, though there was uncertainty in her voice. The listing said it was secluded. Yeah, well, this is giving me serial killer hideout vibes, Sophie added, shifting uncomfortably. The ad for the cabin had described it as a cozy, off-the-grid escape, perfect for a weekend away from the noise of the city. The reviews had been oddly vague, but we figured it was just because people liked their privacy. It wasn't until now, driving deeper into the woods, that I started to wonder if we had made a mistake. Finally, the road ended in a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. Only, it looked older, more rundown than in the pictures. The wooden structure was weathered and darkened, as if the forest had been swallowing it piece by piece. Ivy crept up one side, and the windows were covered in a thin layer of grime. This doesn't look cozy at all, Jake scoffed. Claire shot him a look. Come on, it's just old. It'll be fun once we get settled. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs, and that's when I noticed it. Silence. No birds. No rustling leaves. Just the sound of our footsteps on the gravel driveway. Something about it felt wrong. I walked up to the porch, my boots creaking against the wooden steps. When I reached for the handle, the door swung open before I could even touch it. It wasn't locked. Guess the owner left it open for us. Claire offered, but her voice lacked confidence. Sophie stepped forward, pointing at something near the entrance. What's that? Carved into the wood just beside the door was a strange symbol, circular, with jagged lines radiating outward like a sun. It was old, deep in the wood, as if it had been there for years. I traced it with my fingers, feeling the rough grooves. I don't like this, Jake muttered. Come on, let's just go inside, I said, shaking off the unease. The inside was just as aged as the exterior. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the dim light of the setting sun. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with an old leather couch and a wooden rocking chair nearby. A thick layer of dust covered almost everything, except for the dining table, which had been wiped clean. Sophie wandered toward the fireplace, brushing her fingers over the mantel. Suddenly, she froze. What is it? Claire asked. Sophie reached behind the fireplace and pulled out a small, dust-covered book. A journal, she murmured. She flipped it open, revealing yellowed pages filled with hurried, scribbled handwriting. The ink was smudged in places, but one thing stood out. The first page had a date. October 12, 1987. and beneath it, written in shaky letters, "If you're reading this, it's already too late." Sophie dusted off the old journal and flipped through the fragile pages. The entries were written in hurried, uneven script, the ink fading with time. "Look at this," she murmured, her eyes scanning the first few lines. She cleared her throat and read aloud. October 10th, 1987. The nights are getting worse. I hear it outside, circling the cabin. It never comes in, but I know it wants to. The woods are dead. No animals, no wind, just silence. I don't think I can last much longer. The room felt colder. Claire shifted uncomfortably. That's probably just some old ghost story. Sophie turned the pages carefully. The handwriting grew more erratic, the sentences jagged and desperate. Finally, she reached the last entry. October 12th, 1987. It's in the woods. Watching. Waiting. It knows I see it. If you're reading this, it's already too late. Silence hung between us. Jake forced out a laugh. "Come on, it's just some guy's crazy ramblings. Probably a prank." I wasn't so sure. We tried to shake off the unease as we unpacked. Claire started a fire in the stone fireplace while Jake and I brought in our bags from the car. Night fell quickly, swallowing the cabin in darkness. Without any Wi-Fi or phone signal, we were completely cut off. We gathered around the fire, eating takeout we'd brought with us. The crackling flames filled the silence, but something still felt off. And then it started, a soft, rhythmic knocking on the window. I stiffened. The others heard it too. We all turned toward the sound. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the glass. Jake stood, walking toward the window. He pulled back the curtain. Nothing, just darkness. "It's the wind," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Sophie forced a smile. "Maybe it's just the house settling?" A distant whisper drifted in from the tree line. It was faint, too low to make out the words, but undeniably human. Claire moved closer to me. "Did you hear that?" We listened. The sound came again, a hushed murmur from the woods, carrying on the still night air. It was too far away to tell who or what was making it. The fire flickered, the shadows in the room shifting. Then, with a sudden click, the generator cut out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Claire gasped, and Sophie fumbled for her phone's flashlight. The weak glow barely illuminated the room. Jake groaned. "Great. I'll go check the generator." "I'll come with you," I offered, not wanting him to go alone. We grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The moment the door shut behind us, the silence pressed in. The forest loomed, black and endless. As we approached the small generator shed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My skin prickled. The night was too quiet, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Jake lifted the lid to the generator and sighed. It just tripped. Should be fine now. He reset it, and the cabin lights flickered back on. Relieved, we hurried back inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us from the woods. Something waiting. I told myself it was just paranoia. But deep down, I knew better. Morning came, but the unease from the night before hadn't left. The fire had long since died, leaving only cold embers in the hearth. None of us had slept well. Every small creak of the cabin, every rustling of leaves outside, had kept us on edge. Sophie was the first to get up. She had been flipping through the journal again, her brow furrowed. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered as I joined her by the kitchen window. The woods outside were dense, their shadows stretching unnaturally in the early light. Claire and Jake were still asleep, so Sophie and I decided to step outside, hoping fresh air would clear our heads. But as soon as we walked around the side of the cabin, we stopped in our tracks. Claw marks. Long, deep gouges tore across the back wall of the cabin, as though something had raked massive talons through the wood. The cuts were jagged, uneven, not made by any normal animal. "What the hell?" I whispered, running my fingers over the grooves. Sophie swallowed hard. "This isn't normal." We followed the marks down to the ground, where they stopped abruptly near a trail of footprints, deep imprints in the damp earth, leading into the forest. But none coming back. The sight sent a chill through me. "We should wake the others," I said, before heading back inside. Something else caught my eye, a bit further into the trees, where the undergrowth looked scorched. We approached cautiously. The remains of a burned-down structure stood before us, just past the tree line. Charred beams jutted from the blackened ground, remnants of a building long gone. Ash and collapsed wood covered the earth. Sophie turned to me, eyes wide. Did they mention this in the listing? I shook my head. Not a word. We stepped closer. Something about the ruins felt wrong, as if the land itself was tainted. There were no signs of wildlife, no insects, no birds. Just the silence. That's when we heard it. A soft breath. Not ours. We spun around, scanning the trees, but nothing was there. Sophie grabbed my wrist. Let's go. Now. We rushed back to the cabin, waking Claire and Jake. As we told them what we'd seen, Sophie frantically searched through the journal again. Something's missing, she muttered, flipping back and forth. Then she stopped, staring at the small wooden desk in the corner of the room. She pulled at one of the drawers. It wouldn't budge. Help me, she said. I grabbed the handle with her, and with a sharp tug, the old wood cracked. Pages, torn from the journal, were stuffed inside. Some were crumpled, others folded, as if someone had tried to hide them. Claire picked up one of the pages, her face paling as she read aloud. We thought it only hunted at night. We were wrong. It watches even now. The room felt colder. Jake exhaled sharply. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. It's just some crazy old notes. Someone was messing with us. We need to leave, Sophie said firmly. Claire crossed her arms. Come on, guys. We're just freaking ourselves out. Jake nodded. Yeah, there's nothing here. No ghosts, no monsters, just a creepy old cabin. If we leave now, we're proving we can't handle a weekend without our phones. I wasn't sure anymore. Something about this place felt wrong. But neither Jake nor Claire wanted to leave, and I wasn't about to drive back alone. I sighed. Let's just keep an eye out. If anything else happens, we go. Sophie wasn't happy, but she nodded reluctantly. Outside, the forest remained deathly still. And somewhere, beyond the tree line, something was watching. That night, the knocking came back. It started as before, soft, deliberate taps against the window. But this time, it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I jolted awake, heart pounding. Claire stirred beside me, groggy. Ethan. Then, something new. A sound from the front door. A creak. I shot up, reaching for my phone out of instinct, but remembered, no signal. The room was eerily dim, the dying embers in the fireplace barely casting light. That's when I noticed. Sophie's bed was empty. I froze. Claire, where's Sophie? Claire sat up, her eyes darting to the empty space where Sophie had been. Maybe she's in the bathroom, but then I saw the front door. It was wide open. A chill crawled up my spine. The cold night air seeped in, making the wooden floorboards feel like ice beneath my feet. The forest outside was pitch black. Jake, I hissed, scrambling out of bed and shaking him. He groaned, half asleep, before blinking at the open door. What the hell? A scream cut through the night. Distant, muffled. Sophie. Claire clamped a hand over her mouth. Oh my God, I didn't think. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a kitchen knife from the counter, and a flashlight. Jake did the same. Claire was shaking, but followed close behind as we ran into the woods. The night swallowed us. The trees loomed overhead, black against the starless sky. Sophie, I called. My breath curled in the freezing air. No response. Then we saw it. Sophie's phone, lying in the dirt. The screen was cracked, as if it had been thrown. I picked it up. The screen was still on, frozen on the last thing she had typed in her notes app. The words sent a shiver through me. It's inside. I turned the phone off. My hands were shaking. Guys, Claire whispered. She was pointing at something on the trees. Symbols, carved deep into the bark. The same jagged sun-like shape from the cabin door. But now, it was on multiple trees surrounding us. I swung the flashlight around. The symbols stretched in a wide circle, as if marking something. What the hell does this mean? Jake muttered, stepping closer. That's when we saw it. A trail of blood, dark smears in the dirt, leading deeper into the woods. Claire let out a shaky breath. No, 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 no. Jake swallowed hard. She could still be alive. We have to follow it. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed not to go further. But Sophie was out there. alone. And if we didn't move now, we might never see her again. Gritting my teeth, I gripped the knife tighter. Let's go. And we stepped forward, into the dark. The blood trail led us deeper into the woods, winding through gnarled trees that seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the very forest was holding its breath. Jake's flashlight flickered. Claire stayed close behind me, gripping my arm so tightly her nails dug into my skin. "Sophie," I called again, my voice swallowed by the darkness. No response. Then, movement. A flicker of something between the trees, just ahead. I stopped. "Did you see that?" Jake shined his flashlight toward the spot. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of trees. But then, another movement, to our right. Something tall. It was too fast, too smooth. Like it wasn't walking but gliding. Claire let out a shaky breath. "Oh my God." I turned the flashlight toward the movement, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. A figure, towering and thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its skin was stretched too tight, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And its eyes, they glowed. Not bright, just a faint, eerie shimmer, like dying embers in the dark. Then it moved. Not like an animal, not like a person. Its body jerked, limbs twitching as if its joints didn't work properly. A shuddering, unnatural lurch through the trees. And then it vanished. The flashlight beam caught nothing but empty forest. Jake swore under his breath. Where the hell did it go? A whisper. Soft. Right behind us. Then another, on our left. Then another. And another. The voices surrounded us. They weren't words, not exactly. Just a horrible, rasping hiss, like something speaking through gritted teeth. Claire whimpered. "We need to go. Now." We turned and ran. Branches whipped against my arms, my legs burning as we sprinted back toward the cabin. The whispers didn't fade. They followed us, moving through the trees like something unseen was running alongside us. The cabin came into view, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. I didn't stop. I crashed through the front door, nearly falling inside. Claire and Jake tumbled in behind me, and I slammed the door shut. Jake grabbed a chair, shoving it under the doorknob. Claire ran to the windows, pulling the blinds down. Silence. Nothing but the sound of our ragged breathing. Then Claire gasped. Sophie's backpack. It was sitting on the couch, perfectly placed, as if someone had set it there deliberately. I stepped forward and picked it up. The straps were damp. Mud streaked the bottom. It was her backpack, but Sophie was nowhere to be seen. Jake ran a hand through his hair. "What the hell is happening?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes had landed on something else. The journal. It was open on the table, to a page we hadn't read before. My heart pounded as I read the words, scrawled in desperate, uneven handwriting. "Once it chooses you, you're already gone." I looked around at the others. Sophie was gone, and we were still here. For now. Morning came, but none of us had slept. We sat in silence, the weight of Sophie's disappearance crushing the air around us. The cabin felt smaller, suffocating. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Jake was the first to move. "We need to look for her." His voice was hoarse, exhausted. We didn't want to go back into those woods. But what choice did we have? With our flashlights and knives, we stepped outside. The forest was different in the daylight. Not safer, just exposed. The bare trees stretched upward like brittle bones, their branches swaying in a wind we couldn't feel. And then we saw her, Sophie, propped against a tree at the edge of the clearing. Claire let out a strangled sob and ran toward her, but I grabbed her arm, stopping her just in time. Something was wrong. Sophie wasn't moving. Her posture was unnatural, her limbs stiff, her head tilted forward as if asleep. And then I saw it. Her face was gone. In its place, covering the raw, empty space where her features should have been, a carved wooden mask. Jagged, crudely cut, with deep, hollow sockets where her eyes should have been. The wood was dark with age, etched with those same strange symbols from the cabin door. Claire screamed. Jake swore and stumbled back, his face pale. No, 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 no. I wanted to move, to do something, but my legs wouldn't obey. My breath came too fast, my stomach twisting violently. The mask, it was wrong. It felt like it was looking at us. Claire turned and vomited into the dirt, her whole body shaking. "We have to leave," she choked out. "We have to go? Now." Jake didn't argue. Neither did I. We ran to the car, fumbling for the keys. Jake yanked the door open, jammed the key into the ignition, and click. Nothing. He tried again. Click. Click. He swore and popped the hood. We gathered around him as he lifted it, then froze. The engine was destroyed. Deep, clawed gashes ripped through the metal casing, wires dangling in shredded clumps. It looked as though something had torn it apart with bare hands. Claire stumbled backward. "Oh my God, this isn't possible," Jake stammered, his voice breaking. He grabbed a loose wire, his hands shaking. "This was fine last night." How could?" A whisper. Soft. Faint. Claire's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" Jake and I exchanged glances. "Hear what?" She turned in a slow circle, eyes wide. I heard someone say my name." Jake's hands curled into fists. "That's it. We're walking out of here." "To where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're miles from the main road. We don't even know which direction is safe." Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "Then what? We stay here? We wait for whatever did that." He gestured toward the car. "To come inside next." I didn't have an answer. None of us did. That night, we locked every door, every window. We stacked furniture against the entrance. We kept the fire burning, afraid of the dark swallowing us whole. And yet, it didn't matter, because by morning, Claire was gone, just like Sophie. Jake and I found her bed empty, the front door wide open again, the cold air creeping in like a silent predator. I checked the barricade, untouched. No signs of force, no signs of struggle. She had just walked out. Jake stared at the empty space where she had been, his breathing ragged. "We're next," he whispered. I didn't argue. I already knew it was true. Jake and I didn't speak. We didn't need to. There was only one thought in both of our minds. We had to destroy this place. The firewood stacked near the fireplace would be enough to start a blaze. If we burned the cabin down, maybe, just maybe, it would end whatever was happening here. But first, we had to be sure. There was one place we hadn't checked. The basement. We had barely acknowledged its existence before. Just a small wooden door near the back of the cabin, leading down into God knows what. I had noticed it before, but avoided thinking about it. Now, there was no avoiding anything. Jake held the flashlight with one hand and a fire poker in the other. I clutched the knife from the kitchen, my knuckles white around the handle. The door groaned as I pulled it open. A set of old wooden stairs descended into the darkness. The air was different down there, thick, damp, and filled with a scent that made my stomach churn. Rot. Decay. We stepped down, one slow movement at a time. The flashlight beam cut through the dust, revealing the room beneath us. And then I saw them. Bones. Scattered across the dirt floor. Some human, some not. Symbols were carved into the stone foundation, the same ones we had seen outside. And in the center of the room, a table. No, not a table. An altar. The wood was stained dark with something long dried. Blood. Jake gagged. No. This is a damn killing room. A ritual chamber. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned, and my flashlight caught something scrawled across the far wall in a deep, jagged script. You cannot kill it. You can only feed it. I took a step back, while rising in my throat. Jake, we need to. But Jake wasn't listening. He was panicking, backing away too fast. This is a trap. This whole place. We were never supposed to leave. I reached for him, but he turned and bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. Jake, stop. He threw open the basement door and sprinted outside, straight into the waiting arms of the creature. It was there, standing just beyond the porch, half hidden in the darkness. It moved before I could even process it. One long, impossibly thin arm shot forward, grabbing Jake by the shoulder. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror, as the thing lifted him off his feet like he weighed nothing. I lunged forward, knife in hand, but it didn't matter. The creature's mouth opened, not like a human mouth, but like something unhinging, stretching too wide. Jake's screams turned to gurgles as it pulled him back into the forest. I ran to the door, but by the time I reached the porch, he was gone. The trees stood still, black and unmoving. The only thing left was the echo of his screams fading into the night. And then, just like before, the forest fell silent. I was alone, and I knew it was coming for me next. I was alone. Claire was gone. Jake was gone. Sophie was... whatever was left of Sophie wasn't Sophie anymore. And now, it was my turn. I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. The weight of the journal's final message pressed against my mind. You cannot kill it. You can only feed it. No. If I couldn't kill it, I would destroy everything it had. I would burn this place to the ground. I moved fast. My hands trembled as I grabbed the firewood, ripping apart furniture, soaking everything with the emergency gasoline stored in the shed. The scent burned my nostrils as I poured it across the floor, the walls, the basement steps, the altar, the bones. All of it would turn to ash. I grabbed the fireplace poker and smashed the oil lamp onto the ground. The flames erupted instantly, crawling hungrily across the wood. Smoke billowed up, curling against the ceiling like writhing fingers. The fire spread faster than I expected. Good. Then, the whispering started again. Not distant this time. Right outside. I turned to the window, heart hammering. And that's when I saw it. It stood at the edge of the burning clearing. Fully visible now. No more glimpses, no more fleeting shadows. A tall, emaciated figure, its limbs too long, its body stretched like it had been pulled and twisted into something no longer human. The mask fused to its face wasn't just wood, it was bone. I could see the fractures, the jagged edges where it had once been flesh. Its fingers curled and uncurled, long like broken branches. Its head twitched, jerking at odd angles as if the weight of its own existence was unbearable. Then it moved. Not in a run, not in a sprint. In a series of jagged, stuttering lunges, like reality itself was skipping forward. Each step was too fast, too sudden, covering impossible distance in the blink of an eye. It was coming. And the fire wasn't stopping it. The cabin burned hotter behind me. The walls groaned, embers exploding into the air. But the creature didn't stop. It let out a horrible, ear-splitting screech, something between a human wail and the sound of a tree splintering in a storm. I ran. I bolted into the woods, branches slashing at my face, at my arms. I didn't care. I didn't stop. The whispering surrounded me, hissing my name, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, snapping through the trees, its movements inhuman, closing the distance too fast. Then, light. A break in the trees. I pushed harder, my legs burning, my breath ragged. I burst onto the asphalt, the main road, just as the first rays of sunlight cut through the treetops. And suddenly, the forest went silent. I turned. Nothing. No movement. No creature. Just the charred glow of the burning cabin in the distance. Had I escaped? Had the fire worked? I didn't wait to find out. I stumbled forward, one step, then another, until I collapsed onto the pavement, my body shaking, my heart still hammering. The sun rose higher, and the whispers finally faded. But even now, even as I write this, I know the truth. The fire didn't destroy it. It just made it hungry again. And something tells me, it's still watching.
And so, dear listeners, we reach the end, or perhaps just another beginning. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story haunted you the most. But before you go, remember, the dark is never truly empty.